when I first started covering alternative protein, almost no one was covering alternative protein. So first the issue was, what do we call these proteins, right? And GFI as a whole, not just GFI India, played like a huge role in coming up with this name, alternative proteins. And interestingly enough, even amongst you guys, you don't say alternative protein in India. You say smart protein, because alternative protein didn't really resonate as well. So first there was this kind of like, how do we talk about this topic? That was one thing. Then the second topic was, how do we get the media to talk more about it?
Hi everyone, welcome to the Smart Protein Pod by GF Ideas India, a podcast designed to educate and guide entrepreneurs, students, researchers, and early career professionals in the smart protein sector. We do this by inviting pioneers and trailblazers in science, business, government, and civil society who have shown exceptional vision for the future of our food systems. I'm Ramona Mukherji, Communications Associate at the Good Food Institute India, and your host for the fifth and final episode of the season. For those new here, GF Ideas India is a community started by GFI India for innovators who create or expand access to smart protein solutions and work to advance the ecosystem in India. Working alongside scientists, businesses, and policymakers, GFI India's team focuses on making alternative proteins delicious, affordable, and accessible. An important part of our work here is communicating the value and the need for alternative proteins both clearly and credibly, while uplifting the efforts of the ecosystem at large. To round off this season of the podcast, we're diving into the role of media, messaging, and storytelling, exploring how we can craft optimistic and tenable narratives for alternative proteins that resonate with a diverse set of audiences. So, joining us today from Hong Kong is a leader in the climate and food tech space who knows the ins and outs of alternative proteins. Known globally as the Green Queen, Sonalie Figueiras is the founding editor of Green Queen Media, a digital platform at the intersection of climate and food, and among the first sustainability media houses in Asia. She is also the co-founder and CEO of organic sourcing platform Eco Warehouse and climate tech SaaS platform SourceScreen. With over a decade of experience across media, marketing, entrepreneurship, and impact investing, Sonalie has become a trusted voice in the alternative protein ecosystem. Welcome to the podcast, Sonalie.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here, Ramona.
Yeah, we're definitely very happy to have you here. So I really want to start out with getting to know you a bit more. You had a pretty impressive career trajectory, starting out in finance and management consulting before moving into the climate space and founding Green Queen, first as a blog and now a full-scale media brand. Can you briefly take me through your journey into sustainability and more specifically food and alternative proteins?
Yeah, I mean, it's a story I've told a fair few times, so I will kind of keep it brief, but essentially I faced a lot of health issues when I was younger, and that led me to basically understand the relationship between food and health. And I sort of went down this rabbit hole where I was looking at like what I should be eating, and that led to how the food I should be eating should be grown, and how the food that I was eating had changed from earlier, and how the food system was not just this like benign kind of industry. There were kind of agendas and forces at play that were affecting the food that I was eating that was then not making me feel great. And so that's how I made the connection between how our food is grown and health. And then the further I went into how our food was grown, I kind of learned a lot more around pollution, air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. And that's really when the kind of connection happened. And then like the more you look into like safe foods, the more you start to be confronted with livestock agriculture and how it's very efficient from a price perspective and a volume perspective, but it is not necessarily producing meat and seafood and dairy in a way that is conducive for our health and for the environment. And so that's when the link happened. And then obviously a few years later, I read the seminal report by the UN's FAO about livestock long shadow, which was really the first time I was connecting the dots between livestock and emissions. And that's sort of how I got interested in the topic. And I was writing about, climate, environment, sustainability. We were the first media platform in Asia to really tackle those issues. And the further I got into it, because of my background, which had been, a background with a lot of like research and due diligence and, a business background, if you will, and an analytical background, I started to get more interested in the business side and the systems side of, okay, well, our food system has issues. How are we going to change it? Startups are definitely like a key part of how to fix it and how to make it better. And so how do we do that? What does that look like? And what does that look like globally? Because it was really important to me that we had a global vision, because there were early chatterings at that point around what wasn't yet called alternative protein, but it was mostly in the US. And I felt very strongly that being in Asia, growing up in Asia, we are 60% of the world's population. We are where a lot of the middle class kind of shift and upward mobility is happening. And when people kind of, become middle class, they start to want more animal protein. Originally, I think because of the nutritional value, but eventually also because of status and kind of desirability. And it's such an interesting thing about meat, because status is something that is usually built around scarcity. And so originally, high quality animal proteins were scarce. But as animal proteins have become unscarce, and now they're everywhere, and you can essentially go to McDonald's, one of the cheapest, by dollar calculation way to eat, you can eat animal protein 3 times a day, and it's not scarce at all. And yet it has kept its high status classification. So it's a really interesting thing about animal meat in that way, especially beef. So really felt strongly that Asia should have a voice, that we should be chronicling the space from a global level, not just from an American level. And so really about 7-8 years ago, started diving into more alternative proteins. And food system change and that connection between food and climate. It also was clear to me that there weren't a lot of media outlets that had focused on that connection between food and climate. And there was a lot going on around energy and EVs, and that seemed to have a lot of business press, but the food part didn't. And so really became a niche publication for that. And during COVID, our kind of coverage and our kind of readership really grew. I would say ourselves and Ag Funder are probably the leading sources of coverage on this space.
It's interesting that you say that health brought you to the sector, because that's something that I've personally felt as well. That's kind of what drove my interest into exploring alternative proteins. I'm glad you brought up the Asia perspective. We'll be addressing a number of those points around animal proteins, upward mobility, particularly in Asia. But before we do that, I want to learn a little bit more about your work. So you're a multi-hyphenate, juggling many roles like editor-in-chief, CEO, keynote speaker, venture partner, and much more. Could you give us like a brief understanding of how you know when it's time to double down or pull back from a high-value project? How do you manage your time?
Well, I mean, I think that's an interesting way to phrase the question, because if it's a high value project, I'm probably going to find a way to do it. The world and like the narrative around being busy is very much built around people who do one thing. And I've always been someone who does many things. And I'm definitely one of those people that, like, the busier I am, the more productive I am, the more things I have to do and the more projects I'm involved with, the better I do. the better I feel mentally, the better I perform. So one thing is just like not enough for my personality type. And so I don't see that as a complication. Like even like being a multi-hyphenate. Now, what is a more interesting point is that I've been doing this for so long, way longer than most people. And so I'm very comfortable. Now there's this term fractional that's like really popular. It's all over LinkedIn. I've been a fractional person for 15, 20 years. And so I think that to me, that is more interesting, is that I started this way before it was this like global trend. I think the world has moved in my direction, where people find more happiness doing multiple things and are able to do multiple things. You've got, doctors who like on the side are, influencers, and you've got, bankers who are entrepreneurs, and you've got, people are doing multiple things. And I've always done that, as early as I could. This is a realization I've also made as a mother. When you're a working mother, you just have to be organized, and you have to be smart about, tasks list and documentation and systems so that you're organized for things. And that plays really well into being someone who's a multi-hyphenate doing many things.
Yeah, I think after following your work, there's definitely a through line in the opportunities that you take up. They've all been connected to climate, also food. And they all have a very tangible real world connect. And so that's something I definitely admire. So I want us to dive in to alternative proteins now. Just to situate us within the landscape, you've definitely had a front row seat to the evolution of food and climate journalism over the last decade. I think globally at GFI, we look to Green Queen as one of the publications that consistently covers all aspects of alternative proteins, including research, innovations, reports. From your perspective, how would you say they're being covered differently now versus a few years ago, especially within Asia?
That's a multi-layered question, because when I first started covering alternative protein, almost no one was covering alternative protein. So first the issue was, what do we call these proteins, right? And GFI as a whole, not just GFI India, played like a huge role in coming up with this name, alternative proteins. And interestingly enough, even amongst you guys, you don't say alternative protein in India. You say smart protein, because alternative protein didn't really resonate as well. So first there was this kind of like, how do we talk about this topic? That was one thing. Then the second topic was, how do we get the media to talk more about it? And that was something around trends and cool brands coming on the stage. And especially I would have to give a lot of credit to Impossible Foods. Impossible Foods really showed up and decided to really, really change the way we talk about these products and make it really cool. And I'm a big fan of all the work of the original chief comms officer of Impossible Foods, Rachel Conrad, who memorably had also worked at Tesla and other big companies, and had been a journalist. And actually, it's really interesting because I am a journalist editor, and I now do lots of strategic comms consulting and work. And part of that is inspired by her, where she once said to me, you would be a really great comms officer. And I had never kind of thought about that. So a really fun stat to think about is, I think it used to be like, for every PR person, you had 5 journalists or something like that. And now it's reversed. So for every journalist, you have 5 PR or comms people. And I think the way the world has shifted, and the way digital media has shifted, and the way social media has changed how we consume information, and the way brands connect with audiences, etc. There was a huge story in the Wall Street Journal where it was like, companies are desperate to hire storytellers. And really, that's just a revamping of the role of content production / strategic communication / content strategy, right? And so alternative proteins, to go back to your question, it was like, sort of, how do we cover this? What are we calling it? How do we get more people to talk about it? And then Impossible Foods and a few other brands came on the stage. They made it easier to talk about it. They made journalists want to talk about it and want to write about it. And then, of course, alternative proteins and sustainable protein and kind of shifting away from livestock agriculture became a very, very trendy topic around from 2018 to around 2021 before things really like took a turn. But there was this point in time where Gen Zs were rising, Greta Thunberg was leading, eating meat was understood to be kind of bad for the planet, climate was everything. And there was this kind of swell. And so that was a very exciting time to be writing about these things. And also, don't forget, we had been writing about these things before the groundswell. And so we had this authority. I mean, people were coming up to me and be like, how did you know? I had, investors calling me. I want to have coffee. I want to have lunch. I want to take you here, there, talk to you. I want to pick your brain. Like, what company should I be investing in? What should I be looking at? It was very, very exciting and very, very busy. I mean, we were breaking stories left and right with our tiny team. We could barely keep up. A bunch of other media outlets tried to like jump into the space as well. You also had this kind of like this thing that is really important to talk about because I think it's in the end ended up being one of the reasons why there's been a bit of a backlash, and it's because the vegan media and the alt protein media kind of converged. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a big push from a lot of people in the alternative protein space where they are motivated by veganism or by animal rights. But the problem is that most people, this is something I've tried to explain for years, and I truly believe it. Most people don't want to go to the grocery store and be sold an ideology, whether it's like be a climate warrior or convert to veganism. Most people are going to the grocery store to do something very functional, which is get food. And they're doing that with a certain lens of budget, nutrition, taste, and accessibility.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I mean, you've been leading the charge with alternative protein coverage back before it became a mainstream media kind of item. And now we're at an interesting space where it's going to evolve and the messaging around and the messaging in the audience around who we're catering to will evolve. I want to bring it back to the media landscape a bit more. So like you mentioned, there has been some ups and downs with interest and focus on alternative proteins. So we've started off with the excitement around the Impossible and Beyond burgers, and now we're kind of discussing developments and differing views on cultivated meat. So when we're speaking from a storytelling lens, and how alternative proteins have kind of gone through an evolution, could you take me to some other key watershed moments in the space that you can recall that created a lot of buzz?
Oh, for sure. I mean, what really, obviously valuations, funding rounds, for example, Eat Just getting approval for its chicken in December 2020, by the Singapore government for cultivated chicken. That was a massive one. Like Impossible Foods launching with Dave Chang from Momofuku and kind of that video of the burger. Like I still remember it. I think that was 2016. That was huge. That was like, oh my God, one of the coolest chefs in America is talking about vegan food. Just the whole way Impossible showed up as a brand and with their product and how they approached media and narrative and just kind of coming there and saying, we took a cow and we kind of looked at how beef was made and remade it exactly the same, but just without the cow. And then came like Temasek, one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world, Singapore's, investing in all these like future technologies. And then came, massive valuations and billion-dollar valuations, massive term sheets, Tyndall Foods raising $100 million. Obviously, another big moment that actually happened before was Dr. Mark Post's lab-grown burger from 2013, which at the time I think was meant to cost $300,000 or something. It was like, what is this? Like, can we make food that tastes exactly like animal foods but without the animals? This was like a new way to think about it. So there was a framing that happened that was really exciting. And yeah, just it suddenly there were startups launching every 5 minutes, and that changed the momentum and the velocity at which we were operating.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been heartening to see some of the wins that the sector has had over the years. But as you said, there have been some tensions in the space. So I want to hear more about your perspective on how do you cover these kinds of tensions? How do you balance accurately portraying the current state of industry and its products with some of the forward-looking optimism?
I think Green Queen, one of the reasons that we've become one of if not the favorite source for this kind of news is that we are not pushing an ideology per se. I think we are covering this space with eyes wide open and with accuracy and fairness. And we don't only publish stories that serve a certain agenda. We cover the space, and the news comes as it may, and that's our job. It's like we've always been accurate and like transparent and well researched and balanced. We've never deviated from that. And this is kind of going back to my earlier point. I think there are outlets out there that are like very specifically promoting a vegan worldview, and that's fantastic. And those are wonderful outlets. But that is not the role that we're playing. We're here to talk about food systems and the relation between food systems and climate change. And we're here to portray the issues, the research, the solutions, the people involved in this whole world. And right now, that means a lot of difficult news, a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of M&A, a lot of, closings, a lot of like funding failures. Like, yeah, that's where the space is. That's the reality. And now there is a reckoning around whether VC is the best fit for this space. So that's the funding part and the kind of the startups part. The good news is, there are always people starting new companies. There are always people doing things. There are always strong companies, and there's plenty of strong companies that are surviving and making it work in this more difficult environment. Regulation is another area we cover deeply. We're very policy focused, and regulation is tougher right now. It's not going, in the direction that we hoped it would go, where you have like the EU now going back and saying we can't call burgers and sausages that are not made from animals burgers and sausages. So regulation is tough, but that is an area that we cover. And then we cover research, which includes kind of consumer sentiment. And, it shouldn't be a surprise to you, certainly, that consumer sentiment is not ideal at the moment. There has been a concerted effort to kind of conflate plant-based like meat alternatives. So not plants like beans or tofu or whatever, but really alternatives, to label them as ultra processed foods. And that's been a huge thing to cover. So we actually, I think, have had one of the most accurate and balanced kind of zones of coverage around plant-based and ultra processed foods, where we are very clear-eyed, and we are as fair and transparent as we can be, and we have covered that closely. But at the end of the day, Green Queen is not an opinion Substack. So the news is as it is, and our job is to report on it. We're not telling our readers how to think. I do call Green Queen an impact media, and I always have, because we are in service of addressing the consequences of climate change. So there is impact there. The impact is that I choose to cover this.
We appreciate how Green Queen has always stuck to evidence-based reporting and provides the full and true picture to its readers. I think that's the way that we at GFI India are also trying to approach the sector, staying rooted in data and evidence. So in response to how the sector is evolving, like you mentioned, we are optimistic about government interest, be it in public investment into R&D or policy impetus within climate, food security, nutrition, and public health priorities. But I want to come back to what you said earlier. People don't really go to grocery stores to buy into an ideology or an agenda. Have you faced other pushback when discussing food, which has deep roots in culture, identity, and health, on top of personal preferences or palates?
In my speaking is where I have seen this kind of tension come up. And it comes up every time. And frankly, one of the things that's most interesting about Green Queen is because I speak so much and I speak a lot to audiences that are not necessarily in the industry. I do a lot of speaking at schools and universities and corporates, etc. I was aware that people felt that products like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat were kind of too processed way before it became a media blitz, because I was on the ground and I was being asked that at every single talk that I talked about alternative proteins. I don't think I'm good at everything at all, but I think I am really good at trends and trend forecasting. I really think that I am, and I know it because I've proven it. Like, I knew that climate was going to become a huge topic, and I feel like the first time I met Beyond Meat in a food show and I saw how they were looking at the problem, I felt like this was going to be a huge thing, and that's why I started writing about it and kind of looking into it. And then the year before, I had already said, let's dive into blended proteins, which again, we were very early on, because when I first started in this space, nobody in the space wanted to talk about blended. They thought it was a really bad idea that was never going to work. Now everybody in the space, including GFI, is kind of quite bullish on blended or as we like to call them, balanced proteins, you know? So this is like a newer development. So I think what we're good at Green Queen is kind of seeing stuff before other people and really kind of digging in and getting to know the actors in the space early.
So we've talked a bit about pushback. I want to talk more about the themes that resonate with your audiences. So you've said that your audiences are kind of already bought in or interested in the space.
But they're still bought in, but they're interested. They're interested in food, they're interested in climate, and they're interested in the link between the two.
And there's a lot of ground to cover when it comes to food systems. So there's climate change, there's the public health angle, scientific innovation, nutrition, animal welfare. So which of these themes tend to resonate the most with your audience when either reporting or at your speaking engagements? And among the three modalities, which are plant-based, fermentation-derived, or cultivated meat, or even blended meat for that matter, which generates the most excitement?
I would say the cultivated is a really tough sell. I would say fermented proteins is very interesting from a B2B point of view, and that's really the direction that's going as replacements for ingredients. Fats is an area of interest, because fats are difficult to grow. Oil seeds, require a lot of space. I would say there is some interest in blended and balanced, but not so much from investors. So I mean, it really depends who you're talking about. Like, our audience is broad. We have researchers, we have founders, we have CEOs, we have food system professionals, we have chefs, we have investors. I mean, it's a very broad audience. We're actually going to put out a list of like the most visited stories of the year, so you may want to give that a look. But we cover the whole space, so we're not going to stop covering it because people are like less or more interested in it.
You've spoken of trend forecasting within the space and being a trailblazer. What trends are you seeing in alternative proteins?
I think inclusive dining is a huge trend. And I think that while most people might say, oh, plant-based meat is dead, or like no one's into it anymore, I actually think that if you look at the progress of how it's been accepted in a mainstream way, and like in most big cities, you can go to a grocery store and get, plant-based nuggets. And so like I will always have Impossible nuggets in my freezer, and I'll make sure that I give that to my kids during play dates. That way, like, I don't have to deal with, kids who are not vegetarian and maybe feel like they want to not eat vegetarian food. It looks like a nugget. It tastes like a nugget. They're happy with it. I'm happy because I'm giving them a non-meat alternative, but they don't really see it that way. It's just a nugget. So, and if I go to most restaurants now, I do feel there is an effort towards people who want to eat animal free, people who want to eat lower emissions. I do think we have moved towards better menus, more choices, optionality, as I call it, and inclusivity. So I think those are really interesting. Blended meat is a really interesting one in that scenario. Like if you go to a buffet and it's like, oh, it's half beef and half mushroom or whatever, half lentils, like in a lasagna, I think most people will be like, oh, that's cool. Maybe I'll get more fiber and I'll lower my beef intake. So I do think that that's how I would look at it. Optionality and inclusivity.
So we've spoken a bit about audience. Let's kind of take a zoomed out view a bit. So different regions, including businesses and governments, are approaching the sector a bit differently. From your perspective, what are some of the unique specificities or differences between emerging markets like India or Thailand versus, let's say, Singapore, Hong Kong, or South Korea or Japan? What are the kind of messages that are happening within these countries, and how do they differ?
Well, I would say most of those countries don't have very developed alternative protein markets. I think like Korea and Japan, yes, there is activity at the B2B level and at the cultivated level. And some big corporates have invested in having some like plant-based lines. But in general, like most Japanese consumers and most Korean consumers are not engaging with alternative proteins. They are not like regularly buying alternatives. I don't think we've gotten very far in Korea, and I think there's a long way to go. In Japan, I think, it's hard to tell Japanese people like you need to change your diet to be healthier when they have like the best longevity stats, the best dietary profile stats, like the best cholesterol levels, the best heart rate. Like they are just extremely healthy because there's a few reasons. One, they don't eat that much, so there's not as much obesity. Two, they eat a huge variety of foods when we know that variety is a huge part of being healthy. And in the West, we don't really do that. And three, they eat a lot of seafood and sea vegetables. And it's, I mean, I don't think that you're going to easily be able to tell a Japanese person stop eating seafood. I think that's going to be a hard message. So I only think that's going to change when seafood just becomes really scarce and expensive because we don't have as much of it. Thailand is an interesting one. I mean, yeah, they have a few options, but really what's interesting in Thailand is Thailand's become sort of more like the alternative protein factory where like a lot of brands are made there. But again, in terms of like daily eating, I don't think most Thai people are eating alternative proteins. I think that in most of these markets, including Singapore and Hong Kong, it remains something that a certain percentage of the population does, either because they are vegan or because they are climate conscious and want to lower their emissions. That's it. So in terms of what messaging is working, I mean, what works in Asia is health. So like what worked in Hong Kong for Omnipork was them saying it was cholesterol free. That was a big selling point. That was huge. And for example, maybe you can sell like fish alternatives being plastic free or like, toxin free.
Okay. And what about India? So we have the lowest per capita meat consumption, and we are largely protein deficient as a population. Could you speak more about the Indian context?
Yeah.
And even,
I mean, again, you probably know more about the Indian context than I do, but based on our reporting and what I understand and my experience, India is a very unique market. First of all, average non-Indian seems to think that most Indians are vegetarian. No, they're not. It's 1/3, and actually, it's a shrinking 1/3. Number two, India is one of the unique countries where beef is not the dominant status meat. It is chicken, and to some extent mutton. But pork and beef are sort of like out of the picture. However, from a systemic point of view, that's actually not true. Like India has quite a big cattle export population, and there's a big dairy problem in India. So that's the big problem in India is dairy. dairy's footprint. And actually, we have a fantastic piece coming out by one of the fellows for our climate feed fellowship that we launched at Green Queen, the first one ever. So as part of that, we had 6 journalists from all around the world. 2 of them are from India, and one of them is doing a fabulous story on the climate and human cost of India's dairy crown, and it's really excellent. So I have actually been diving into it because I've been editing the piece with the writer, and that's India has a huge problem with dairy. I mean, it has more smallholder dairy farmers than anywhere in the world. Indians love dairy, especially northern Indians, and it's good growing. I mean, people see dairy as like absolutely integral to health. Yogurt, milk, ghee, which is clarified butter, and so that's a problem. But that's, I guess you could say, less about protein. I'm not sure that Indians are making the connection every day between dairy and protein. I think the problem with Indians are deficient in protein is the problem with these statistics for a country like India is that India is a huge country. It's not 66 million French people. It's 1.4 billion people. And the problem when you're looking at statistics at that level is that like Indians who are protein deficient tend to be extremely poor. And so we need to not conflate the protein deficiency being a result of vegetarian diets, and actually it's a result of poverty and not having enough access to food. That's the problem. So I do think that coverage sometimes is a bit problematic for me. I mean, don't get me wrong, in Green Queen, we've also used that statistic in our coverage because it's a true statistic. But if you take a step back and you kind of dive in, a huge section of Indians remains extremely poor. I don't think those people are part of the conversation you want to have, which is urban, young, populations or kind of middle class and up populations, and whether they eat enough protein and whether they feel that they need to eat alternative. That's different from the statistics.
Do you have a perspective on how alternative or smart proteins can fit in for the larger population? And by that I mean, GFI India, we're also recognizing that maybe the biomimicked meat stands won't work for the entire population. We're moving towards, how do we deliver these in formats that are going to be more price effective, be more accessible? Do you have a sense of how smart proteins could fit into the picture for India in terms of nutrition and food security?
I think for middle class and up, it's going to be a health play, the same as in China, the same as in Singapore, and kind of like the wealthier Asian populations. I think what happens at middle class and up, especially with like younger urban populations, is actually quite similar across the globe, which is it's trend focused, it's fitness focused. There's a rise in interest in health span, longevity, wellness, like being fit, and all of those things conflate with a rise in interest in nutrition and wanting better nutrition. So protein powders. So I think there's a real play for like, how do we get the protein powders to be made from fermented dairy proteins rather than dairy?
It's been an extremely insightful conversation so far, Sonalie. Before we wrap up, I have one final question. This is something that we ask all our guests at the end of the episode. If you were to read a front page headline in India's largest newspaper in 2035 about smart proteins, what would you hope for it to be?
Something like dairy industry cuts emissions by 50%, or 50% of urban Indians exclusively get their dairy proteins exclusively from fermentation, something like that.
Yeah, I think that would be an important milestone to reach, so I definitely hope we get there.
Yeah. Cool question.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today, Sonalie. I really can't think of a better guest to close out this season. Your insights into this conversation have been extremely invaluable, and I definitely hope this conversation is both informative and inspiring for our listeners. With that, we will wrap up this episode and this season of the Smart Protein Pod. To collectively spearhead the sector, we need like-minded community members who share our passion to advance the mission for smart protein. If you haven't already, you can join the GF Ideas India community, a space for individuals to connect, collaborate, and discover extraordinary opportunities that can help advance our smart protein goals. You can find guidelines to join the community in the description box. If you find this episode useful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hit the bell icon. And if something resonates with you, drop us a comment or write to us at india@gfi.org. We'd love to hear from you. If you're listening on Spotify, don't forget to follow, turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for listening, everybody.